My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 69 years old. I've been a certified personal property appraiser for 35 years. And in 35 years, I have never once misjudged what a thing was actually worth. Not a Chippendale chair. Not a Tiffany brooch. Not a hairline crack running through the back of a new vase that some auction house intern missed and I didn't. So when my daughter-in-law sold my late husband's watch without asking anyone, I already knew two things before I even opened my laptop to confirm it. I knew exactly how much money she thought she'd gotten away with. And I knew she had no idea what else was sitting in that safe. I found the listing on a Tuesday morning in March, 14 months after Walter died. A colleague of mine, a woman named Miriam Sato who runs a vintage watch boutique outside Philadelphia, sent me a single text message. "Eleanor, isn't this Walter's Calatrava?" I clicked the link with my coffee going cold in my hand. There it was. Rose gold case. The faint scratch on the crystal from the year Walter dropped it on the marina dock in 1994 and refused to have it polished out because he said a watch should show it's been lived in. Listed for $71,000. My husband's watch, the one thing in this house I had told my son and my daughter-in-law, in writing, was never to be sold, listed on a stranger's website with a stock photo lighting setup and a description that called it a beautiful estate piece from a private collector. I am the private collector. Nobody asked the private collector anything. But the watch, as it turned out, was only the opening line of a much longer sentence. Behind it was a safe my daughter-in-law thought she understood completely, and a ledger inside it she never once thought to look for, because in 35 years of cataloging other people's lives for a living, I learned one thing above all else. People who steal only ever look for what they expect to find. Welcome back to Gia Mom Stories, where mothers share the moments that tested everything they built, and the quiet precision that carried them through. If this sounds familiar, if someone in your family has ever decided that what's yours is simply available, stay with me, and be sure to subscribe. Eleanor Whitfield. Accredited Senior Appraiser, certified through the American Society of Appraisers in 1991. 35 years valuing estates, antiques, fine jewelry, and horology for insurance companies, probate courts, and private collectors across 3 states. I run Whitfield Associates appraisals out of a converted carriage house behind my home in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, population 4,100, one appraiser, me. My father was a machinist outside Allentown. He spent 40 years learning the exact tolerances of steel, learning that a 16th of an inch is the difference between a part that works and a part that fails catastrophically. I spent 35 years learning the same lesson about objects. A hallmark that's a millimeter off. A patina that's 3 years too even to be real. A signature that's almost right. Almost right is how forgeries get sold and how families get robbed. I don't miss almost right. I never have. I put myself through the Appraisers Association certification program at night while working days at an antique gallery and reading, cataloging estate contents for widows who didn't know what their husbands' desks were worth until I told them. I started my own practice at 34 with a $22,000 loan from my father, a rented carriage house, and a conviction that small towns needed somebody who could look at grandma's brooch and tell you, honestly, whether it was worth insuring or worth nothing at all. 35 years later, I've appraised 6,400 estates. Not one contested valuation. Not one insurance claim overturned on appeal because I got a number wrong. I know the provenance of half the good silver in this county. I know which family's grandfather clocks are genuine Seth Thomas and which are 1970s reproductions nobody's told them about. People trust me with the true worth of the things they love most. I didn't know I couldn't trust the woman my son married with the true worth of me. My office sits behind the main house, white clapboard, green shutters, a brass bell over the door that Walter installed the year we opened, the same year Reagan was in his second term. The carriage house smells the way it's always smelled. Old wood, museum wax, the particular mineral scent of polishing cloth on sterling silver. I've stood behind that appraisal table for 35 years, and I carry that smell home with me every night the same way a doctor carries the smell of a hospital. Walter used to say I smelled like other people's history. He wasn't wrong. I smelled like 35 years of telling the truth about what things cost and what they were worth, which, I learned far too late, are not always the same question. Walter Whitfield. 68 when I lost him. A mechanical engineer for a turbine manufacturer outside Allentown for 38 years, and in every hour he wasn't at that plant, a watchmaker's son who never stopped loving watches. His father had repaired pocket watches in a back room in Bethlehem for 40 years, and Walter grew up at that workbench with a loop screwed into his eye socket before he was 10. He didn't repair watches for a living. He engineered turbines. But he collected them the way some men collect regret, quietly, patiently, one piece at a time, for nearly 40 years. 11 watches by the time he died. Vintage pieces, mostly, bought at estate sales and small regional auctions long before vintage watches became a fashionable investment. A 1962 Patek Philippe Calatrava in rose gold, the one his own father had helped him identify as authentic, the crown jewel of the collection. A 1968 Omega Speedmaster. A 1950s Rolex Explorer with a dial so evenly aged that collectors call that patina tropical and pay a premium for it. Cufflinks that matched. A sapphire and diamond brooch that had belonged to his mother. I catalogued every piece myself. Not as his wife. As his appraiser. Photographs from 4 angles. Movement numbers recorded by hand in a leather ledger Walter kept in his desk drawer, a habit his father had drilled into him. Write down the serial number the day you acquire a piece, because a serial number is the only thing a thief can't successfully lie about. I insured the whole collection collectively at $340,000 through a fine arts and collectibles rider, renewed every 3 years with updated photographs. I know exactly what was in that safe the day my husband died, because I am the one who put a number on every single item in it. Walter died on a Thursday in January, 14 months before all of this started. A stroke, sudden, no warning, in the garden shed while he was oiling the hinge on the greenhouse door. 38 years of marriage, and then a Thursday, and then a house that was suddenly far too quiet for 2 people's worth of furniture. 2 weeks before he died, though of course neither of us knew that's what those 2 weeks were, Walter sat me down at his workbench and opened the safe himself. Gray steel, bolted to the floor of his study behind a false panel in the closet, installed the year we bought the house. Inside, the 11 watches in their cases, his father's original watchmaking tools, the collection ledger, our wills, and the fine arts insurance policy. Eleanor, he said, if anything ever happens to me, this collection doesn't get sold off piecemeal by somebody who doesn't understand what they're looking at. You catalogued it. You know what it's worth. You decide what happens to it. He laughed a little. Don't let Nathan's wife anywhere near my father's watches. She thinks a Cartier love bracelet is old if it's from before Instagram. I laughed too. I didn't know I'd be quoting him from memory a year later in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Our son, Nathan. 39 years old. A regional sales manager for a medical supply distributor, steady work for 12 years until the territory got restructured 18 months ago and his client base was cut nearly in half overnight. Not fired. Just quietly, corporately diminished. He and his wife Vanessa have 1 son, Milo, 4 years old, a serious little boy who likes to sort his toy cars by color and who called Walter Grandpa Time because Walter always let him hold a pocket watch up to his ear. Nathan is a good man who has spent his entire adult life avoiding conflict the way some people avoid heights. Gentle. Steady with his hands, unsteady with his voice. He loved his father fiercely and has never once, in 39 years, told his wife no about anything that mattered. Vanessa Cole Whitfield. 35. She married Nathan 9 years ago, a small ceremony at a vineyard in Lancaster County that her family could not entirely afford and that her sister Courtney helped finance without ever letting anyone forget it. Vanessa worked in luxury real estate staging for 6 years, dressing other people's houses in rented furniture to photograph well for buyers who'd never actually live with any of it, and then the market softened and the staging contracts thinned out, and for the past year and a half she's told people she's consulting, which as far as I can tell means she checks her phone a great deal and hasn't billed anyone in 14 months. I want to be fair to Vanessa, because understanding somebody isn't the same as excusing them, and I spent 35 years learning that the two things can live in the same sentence without canceling each other out. Vanessa grew up the younger of 2 daughters in a comfortable house in Harrisburg, but her older sister Courtney was, by every measurable standard, the golden one. Better grades, then a better college, then a job in luxury real estate that turned into her own boutique consignment business, Heirloom Time, a shop outside Philadelphia that resells estate jewelry and vintage watches to people who want old money aesthetics without the old money. Their mother compared the two sisters at every holiday dinner for 30 years, and Vanessa spent her whole life 2 steps behind a sister who always seemed to land on her feet in nicer shoes. Marrying into the Whitfield family felt, I think, like Vanessa's first real chance to be the sister with something. A paid-off house. A collection her mother-in-law had once heard described, at a dinner party, as worth a fortune. Vanessa wanted, very badly, to be the one who finally had more than Courtney. I understand that hunger. I don't excuse what she did with it. I met Courtney only a handful of times over the years, always at holidays, always impeccably dressed in a way that made her seem to belong to a slightly wealthier family than the one she'd actually grown up in. She had a habit of picking up an object in someone else's home, turning it over, checking the underside for a maker's mark, the exact gesture a dealer makes when she's pricing something in her head without meaning to. I noticed it the first Thanksgiving I met her, the way she lifted one of my crystal candlesticks and studied the base before setting it down and complimenting the tablecloth instead. Dealers do that. Guests generally don't. I filed it away the same way I file away a hairline crack in a vase, not as an accusation, just as a fact worth remembering. I remember a Sunday dinner about 2 years before Walter died, the whole family at our table. Vanessa mentioned, almost lightly, that Courtney had just sold a diamond estate necklace to a client for $40,000 and made 18% on the deal alone. Isn't that wild, she said, looking at Walter's watch case on the sideboard where he sometimes displayed a piece after cleaning it. People pay so much for old things. Walter said, some old things are worth it. Vanessa went quiet in a particular way. I recognized that quiet. I'd seen it at estate walkthroughs, the exact expression of an heir doing arithmetic in her head about a house that hadn't been marketed. I should have paid more attention to that quiet. But I was cataloging an estate in Grailstone. I was always cataloging something. After Walter died, Nathan and Vanessa began coming by more often. I was grateful, at first. Grief makes a house echo, and having Milo underfoot on Sunday afternoons, sorting his toy cars on my kitchen floor, was the only thing that made the silence bearable. Vanessa offered to help with paperwork, the death certificate copies, the insurance notifications, the endless bureaucracy that follows a death like a second smaller death. I let her. I was tired in a way I hadn't been tired since 1988, and an extra pair of hands felt like mercy. 11 months ago, Nathan needed the fine arts insurance policy number to submit a routine review with our agent, a formality after Walter's death to confirm the writer stayed active under my name alone. I gave him the safe combination over the phone, 4 digits I'd used since we bought the house, a number Walter had never bothered to change because he trusted every person who'd ever known it. I told Nathan exactly what I keep in that safe. The watches, the ledger, the policy, our estate documents. I told him because I trusted him the way I'd trusted his father for 38 years. That's the mistake I made. Not giving him the number. Assuming that trust travels automatically to whoever's standing next to the person you trust. I checked the safe myself perhaps twice a year, always before the insurance renewal, always with the ledger open beside me, cross-referencing serial numbers the way I'd catalog any client's estate. It never occurred to me to check it more often. In 35 years, nobody had ever needed watching in my own home. I'd spent my whole career watching other people's families. I never once thought to watch mine. 7 months ago, a Tuesday, I opened the safe to update the insurance writer ahead of its triennial renewal. I laid the ledger open on Walter's desk the way I always did, matched each case against its entry, and reached for the rose gold Calatrava case in its usual place, second shelf, left side, cushioned in the blue velvet tray Walter's father had used for 50 years. The case was there. It was empty. I sat very still for a long moment, the way I do when I'm looking at a piece I suspect is a forgery and I need my hands to stop moving before I trust my eyes. I checked the ledger entry. Page 6, Item 4. 1962 Patek Philippe Calatrava, rose gold, movement number recorded, appraised value $95,000. I checked the case again. Empty velvet, the faint outline where a watch had sat undisturbed for years, slightly darker than the surrounding fabric, exactly the way dust marks a shelf where a picture frame used to sit. I did not call anyone. I did not confront anyone. In my line of work, you never accuse a client of forgery on a hunch. You verify first, because an accusation you can't support destroys the only thing an appraiser actually sells, which is being believed. I closed the safe. I made coffee. I opened my case notebook, the plain black one I use for every disputed estate I've ever worked, and I wrote a new heading at the top of a clean page. Whitfield Collection, Discrepancy Log. Item 1. Date discovered. Item description. Ledger reference. Appraised value. Last confirmed present. I have used that exact format for 35 years to build cases that hold up in probate court. I was about to use it, for the first time, to build a case against my own family. I checked the rest of the safe that afternoon, methodical, the way I'd walk through any estate. The Omega was present. The Rolex Explorer was present. But Walter's mother's sapphire and diamond brooch was gone, and so were the cufflinks that matched the Calatrava, a pair Walter had bought specifically to wear with it at our 40th wedding, no, our 35th. He never got the 40th. 3 items missing. The Calatrava, appraised at $95,000. The brooch, appraised at $6,500. The cufflinks, appraised at $2,200. Total, so far, $103,700. I called Miriam Sato that same week, not with an accusation, only a question, framed the way any appraiser might frame professional curiosity. Miriam, if a vintage Patek Calatrava came up for private sale in this region, would you likely hear about it? Miriam laughed. Eleanor, I hear about every decent vintage piece within 200 miles within a week. It's a small world. I'll keep an ear out. 3 months passed before her text came through with the listing. 3 months in which I said nothing to Nathan, nothing to Vanessa, and continued having Sunday dinners at my own table with a woman I now suspected had walked out of my house with $103,700 of my late husband's memory in her purse. I want to explain why I waited, because I imagine some of you are asking why a woman who found an empty velvet case didn't simply confront her daughter-in-law on the spot. In 35 years of contested appraisals, I learned the single most important rule of building a case that survives contact with a lawyer: you document completely before you speak once. The moment you accuse, the evidence starts disappearing faster than you can photograph it. I was not going to lose the rest of Walter's collection to my own impatience. So I waited. And while I waited, I watched. I noticed, over those months, the way Vanessa's eyes moved across a room during Sunday dinner, not looking at the furniture the way a guest looks, but assessing it the way a dealer assesses inventory. I noticed she'd started asking, with increasing casualness, what Walter's other watches were worth these days, always phrased like idle curiosity, always circling back within a few sentences to the Calatrava specifically, as though she were checking whether I'd noticed anything. I noticed Nathan had stopped mentioning job applications. I noticed a for sale sign go up 2 streets over on a house considerably larger than the one they currently rented, and I noticed Vanessa mention it at dinner with the specific brightness of a woman who has already decided something and is waiting for the money to catch up to the decision. I did not know yet where the money for that house was supposed to come from. I would. 4 months ago, I drove out to Miriam's boutique on a Saturday and sat with her in the back office over the listing screenshot, now with the seller's account details visible in the site's cached metadata, the kind of technical trail most people never think to check because most people don't spend 35 years learning how provenance gets faked and, therefore, how it gets traced. The seller account was registered under the name Courtney Cole, Vanessa's sister. The consignment shop was Heirloom Time. Miriam pulled up 3 more listings from the same seller account, spaced roughly 2 months apart. A sapphire and diamond brooch, estate provenance, price $5,800. A pair of vintage gold cufflinks, $1,900. And, most recently, a men's vintage Omega chronograph, $12,500, though when I checked my own safe that evening, the Omega was still exactly where it belonged. Someone had listed a description close enough to Walter's Omega to make my stomach drop for an hour before I confirmed, hands shaking slightly as I turned the case in the desk lamp, that this particular watch was still mine. It meant Courtney's shop was moving multiple pieces through the same channel, not all of them necessarily mine, but at least 3 of them unmistakably were. Item 4, added to the discrepancy log. Cross-reference, seller account Courtney Cole, Heirloom Time Consignment, Doylestown, Pennsylvania. 3 confirmed listings matching Whitfield ledger entries. Estimated combined resale value, $103,700 at retail, likely consigned at 55 to 60% of that to the seller, per standard consignment structure, meaning Vanessa's actual take was somewhere near $57,000 to $62,000, with Courtney keeping the difference as commissary. This part isn't about the theft, I said. This part is about your father, Nathan. I found this in the back of his collection ledger, in a hidden sleeve he built into the binding himself. He wrote it nearly 6 years before he died. I read Walter's words aloud, slowly, the exact sentence that had sat with me for 2 months. If Nathan and Vanessa ever need help, help them with cash, not with the collection. My father built these with his hands over 40 years and so did I. Don't let anyone tell you sentiment doesn't have a market value. It has the only value that matters. Nathan was crying now, openly, his shoulders shaking the way they hadn't since the funeral. Vanessa had gone still, staring at the page, at her dead father-in-law's handwriting laid out in a hidden compartment inside a hidden compartment, evidence not of what she'd done but of exactly how thoroughly Walter had anticipated that someone, someday, might try. "Dad knew," Nathan said, barely audible. "He knew this could happen." "He didn't know it would be Vanessa specifically," I said. "He knew, in the way careful men always know, that anything valuable eventually gets tested by somebody. He built a hidden compartment inside his own ledger, the same way his father hid small parts inside a book spine. That's what watchmakers do. They plan for the moment the mechanism gets stressed." Vanessa's voice, when it finally came, was small and defensive in the exact way I've heard from 100 estate disputes before this one. "You don't understand what it's been like. Nathan lost half his territory 18 months ago. We've been drowning, Eleanor. Courtney offered to help move a few pieces, just to get us through, and I told myself you had 11 watches, you'd never even notice 2 or 3. I noticed the first one in 7 months," I said. "I noticed because I catalog everything I own the same way I catalog everything I appraise for a living. You didn't take from a woman who wouldn't notice. You took from the one woman in this family whose entire profession is noticing." Nathan looked at his wife. "How long, Vanessa? How long has this been going on?" 7 months. Maybe 8. "And Courtney knew where the pieces came from?" Vanessa didn't answer. I answered for her. "Your sister runs a consignment shop that specializes in estate jewelry, Nathan. She didn't ask where a 95,000 Patek Philippe came from because she didn't want to know. That's not naivety. In my business, we call that willful blindness, and it carries the same weight as knowing." Frances spoke for the first time, quiet, measured, exactly the voice you'd want reading testimony back to a courtroom. "Eleanor has receipts and documentation for every claim on that table. I've read the full file. It's thorough." Vanessa turned to her, something sharp rising in her voice. "This is a family matter. We don't need a witness for a family matter. It stopped being only a family matter the moment items left this house and were sold through a commercial consignment business," Frances said, and went quiet again, having said exactly enough and not one word more. I closed the 5th tab and opened the 6th. "Here's what happens now," I said. "My attorney, Harold Benning, has prepared a formal notice. Criminal charges for theft of estate property, and potentially receiving and reselling stolen property against Courtney, remain fully available to me. I am not filing them today." Vanessa looked up, something like hope moving across her wet face. "I am not filing them today if the following happens. 1. The $71,000 I spent recovering the Calatrava is repaid to me in full, on a payment schedule Harold and I will set, because that money should never have left my account to begin with. 2. The $8,700 in unrecoverable items is repaid as well, the full appraised value, regardless of what you and Courtney actually netted. 3. Courtney provides Harold with complete consignment records for every item sold through her shop over the past 8 months so we can confirm nothing else of mine passed through her hands. 4. There is no contact between Courtney and this household regarding my property, or Walter's collection, ever again. If any condition isn't met, Harold files everything, and the case file on this table becomes evidence in a courtroom instead of a dining room." I placed my hand flat on the folder. "And 5. This collection, all of it, is mine outright. It always was. Your father wrote that down himself 6 years before he died, and I've had Harold formalize it into a codicil so there's no ambiguity for either of you, ever again, about what happens to these watches when I'm gone. They are not an inheritance to be managed early. They are a decision I will make when I am ready to make it, and not one moment before." The dining room was silent except for the faint sound of Milo's cartoon leaking through the closed den door and Vanessa's uneven breathing. Nathan finally spoke, his voice raw. Mom, I had no idea. I swear to you I had no idea. I believe you, Nathan, I said, and I did. You didn't take anything. But you also didn't ask where the extra grocery money was coming from these past few months, or why Vanessa suddenly stopped worrying about the mortgage on a house she can't currently afford. I'm not accusing you of theft. I am telling you that not asking a question you already suspected the answer to is its own kind of choice. He put his head in his hands. I know. Vanessa, I said, turning back to her, I understand you've been frightened. Watching your husband's income shrink while your sister's business grows is a particular kind of humiliation, and I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I think it's true, and because understanding why you did this doesn't require me to accept what you did with it. Fear explains a great deal. It doesn't sign a receipt for $95,000. Nathan wiped his face and looked up, something clicking into place behind his eyes. The house, he said quietly. The one 2 streets over. That's what the money was for. Vanessa didn't answer, which was answer enough. You were going to put a down payment on a house we can't afford, using money from my father's watches, and you were going to let me believe we'd finally saved enough on our own, Nathan said, and for the first time all evening his voice had an edge in it I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager arguing with his own father about curfew. That's not fear, Vanessa. That's a plan. I panicked, and then I kept panicking, and every week that passed without telling anyone made the next week harder to tell anyone, Vanessa said, and I recognized that shape of logic too. I've heard it from a dozen executors who quietly borrowed against an estate they were only supposed to be managing, always meaning to pay it back before anyone noticed, always finding one more reason the timing wasn't right. I don't know what to say, Vanessa whispered. You don't need to say anything right now, I told her. You need to sign the acknowledgement Harold prepared, and then we're going to figure out, together, whether this family survives what you did to it. I closed the folder. In 35 years, I have never misjudged what something was worth. I looked at both of them. I misjudged what my own family was worth exactly once. I trusted it completely and never once checked. That's the last time that happens. The room stayed quiet for a long while after that. Francis didn't move. Nathan wept, quietly now, the exhausted kind of crying that comes after the loud kind has burned itself out. Vanessa sat with her hands over her face, and when she finally lowered them, something in her expression had changed, not into remorse exactly, but into the recognition that the version of events she'd been telling herself for 7 months would not survive contact with a leather folder and 14 numbered tabs. I want to explain something, Vanessa said finally, her voice steadier than before. Not to excuse it. Just so you understand. Courtney's always been the one who has things figured out. I've spent my whole life watching her land on her feet while I scrambled. When Nathan's territory got cut, I panicked. And then I was in your study one day looking for the insurance folder, and the safe was open, and it felt like here was a way to finally be the sister with something, instead of the one always asking for help. I let that sit for a moment, the way I let any difficult truth sit before responding to it. I understand wanting to be more than the sister who's always behind, I said. I've watched siblings compete my entire career, over inheritances, over collections, over who gets grandmother's china. It's one of the oldest stories in my profession. But you didn't take something that was ambiguously yours to divide. You took something that belonged to a specific, living person who was standing right in front of you every Sunday, and you decided my grief made me an easier mark than my attention would have made me a hard one. That was the miscalculation. Not the fear. The assumption that I wouldn't notice. Nathan lifted his head. What happens to us now, Mom? Do you want us out of your life? No, I said, and I meant it, though it cost me something to say. I want Milo to grow up with a grandmother in his life, and I want you, Nathan, to grow up a little yourself, because 39 is late to start, but it's not too late. I am not cutting either of you off. I am telling you exactly what it will cost, in dollars and in trust, to stay in it. Both of those things are now going to be rebuilt slowly, on a schedule, the way any damaged asset gets restored. Not all at once. Not on good faith alone. Vanessa nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Okay. I called Harold the next morning to confirm the notice would go out to Courtney within the week if the consignment records weren't produced voluntarily. They were produced within 4 days. Courtney's shop had moved 11 pieces through consignment in the prior 8 months belonging to 3 different families, not only mine, and Harold's letter, along with a second one from a different aggrieved family who'd independently identified similar irregularities, was enough to have Heirloom Times business insurance dropped within 2 months and Courtney's standing with the Regional Antiques Dealers Association quietly, permanently revoked. I didn't cause that outcome alone. I simply stopped protecting her by staying silent, the same way I'd stopped protecting Vanessa the moment I opened that folder. Vanessa and Nathan sold their car, a leased SUV they genuinely could not afford, and began paying me back on the schedule Harold drew up, $400 a month against the $79,700 owed, which at that rate will take them until Milo is 17 years old, and I told them both, plainly, that this was intentional. Some debts should take long enough to repay that you remember, every month, exactly what they cost. 6 weeks after that Sunday dinner, Nathan came by the carriage house alone on a Saturday morning. He sat across from me at the appraisal table where I've valued 6,400 estates and told me, quietly, that he'd started therapy, and that his therapist had used a phrase that stuck with him. Conflict avoidance is just fear wearing a nicer outfit. He said he understood now that every time he'd stayed silent while Vanessa spent beyond what they had, every time he'd chosen not to ask a question he already half knew the answer to, he'd been protecting his own comfort, not hers. I failed Dad 100 times before that watch ever went missing, he told me. Every time I let something slide because asking felt harder than not asking. You knew that about yourself for years, I said. Why didn't you ever say it out loud? Some things a person has to find on his own, I told him. I could have told you 1,000 times. It took an empty velvet case to make you believe it. He sat with that for a while, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table the way his father used to turn a watch case before opening it, checking it from every angle before committing to anything. Dad used to say you could tell how a person had been raised by whether they apologized for taking up space or apologized for the actual thing they did, he said finally. I think I've spent my whole marriage apologizing for taking up space. I never once made Vanessa apologize for the actual thing. That's a good thing to have noticed, I told him. It's an even better thing to say out loud to her, instead of just to me. I'm trying, he said. It's slower than I want it to be. Everything worth restoring is slower than you want it to be, I told him. I've spent 35 years reassembling estates that took people 50 years to accumulate and about 10 minutes to nearly lose. Patience isn't a virtue in my line of work. It's the only method that actually works. He's different now, slowly, the way real change usually is. He speaks up at dinner in ways he didn't used to. He asked me, unprompted, 3 weeks ago, whether Vanessa had actually been attending the joint financial counseling sessions Harold had made a condition of the repayment schedule, and when I told him I didn't know, he said, I'll ask her myself tonight, which is a sentence I don't believe my son would have said a year ago. Courtney has not reached out to me, and I did not expect her to. I heard through Francis, who heard it from a mutual acquaintance in the antiques trade, that Heirloom Time closed its Doylestown location entirely 3 months after Harold's letter, and that Courtney has since taken a position doing inventory management for a furniture warehouse outside Reading, work considerably less glamorous than dressing estate jewelry for wealthy strangers. I take no particular satisfaction in that, though I won't pretend I take none at all. A person who builds a business on not asking questions eventually runs out of people willing not to ask questions of her in return. Vanessa I am still careful with. She has not fully apologized in the way I think a full apology requires, which is not an accounting of her own fear but an accounting of my loss, and I've told Harold I'm in no hurry to soften that requirement. But she's kept every payment on schedule. She sold 2 designer handbags to make the first one, which is not nothing, coming from a woman who once told me, quite sincerely, that Milo's baby book needed a leather cover from a particular Italian stationer or it wouldn't feel right. Small changes. I've learned, across 6,400 estates, that real restoration in a family, like real restoration in an antique, happens in small, unglamorous, often invisible increments, not in a single dramatic reveal, no matter how satisfying the reveal itself might be. There is a version of this story where I confronted Vanessa the same afternoon I found the empty velvet case, where I raised my voice, where the whole family fractured in a single loud evening instead of a slow, documented. I think about that version sometimes, like the way you think about a road you didn't take. I don't believe it would have gotten me my husband's birch bag, or the coverings, or the full truth about Courtney's shop, or Walter's private notebook, which I might never have gone looking for at all if I hadn't already been in the habit of checking every corner of that safe. Patience isn't softness. In my experience, it's usually the harder, slower, more exacting choice, and it is very often the only one that actually recovers what was lost instead of simply announcing that a loss occurred. The Calatrava sits in my safe now, catalogued once more, its ledger entry updated with a new line I added myself. Recovered March, this year. Chain of custody documented. Never leaves this house again without my signature. I wind it myself every Sunday morning, the way Walter used to, and some Sundays I let Milo hold it up to his ear the way his grandfather did, and he asks me, every single time, "What does time sound like, Grandma?" And I tell him it sounds exactly like this, small and patient and ticking along whether or not anyone's paying attention, which is the truest thing I know about both watches and families. I started teaching a class at the County Senior Center 2 months ago, an evening course on protecting a family collection or estate from exactly this kind of loss. How to catalog what you own. How to record serial numbers and provenance in a place a thief won't think to look. How to notice, early, the particular quiet a person gets when they're doing arithmetic about what you have and they don't. 9 people came to the first session. 2 of them stayed afterward to tell me quietly that something very similar had already happened in their own homes, and they'd never told anyone because they were ashamed of how long it had taken them to notice. By the 3rd session, the class had grown to 17. I brought Walter's collection ledger as a teaching example, not the recovered pages, just the format, and showed them how to build the same kind of record for their own homes. Photographs from 4 angles. Serial numbers written down the day you acquire something, because a serial number is the one thing nobody can successfully lie about later. A woman named Ruth, 74, came up to me afterward with her late husband's cufflinks in a small velvet box, asking if I'd help her catalog what remained of his estate before, in her words, anyone else in the family got any ideas. I told her I would, free of charge, on a Thursday afternoon the following week. I've done 6 more of these quiet, unpaid catalog sessions since, for women who recognized something of their own uncertainty in my story before I'd even finished telling it. I spent 35 years billing people for exactly this kind of work. I don't charge for it anymore when the person asking has already been hurt once. Milo still doesn't fully understand what happened, and I intend to keep it that way for as long as I reasonably can. What he understands is that Grandpa Time's favorite watch lives in Grandma's safe again, and that some Sunday mornings, if he's been good and washed his hands, he gets to hold it up to his ear. I keep a small framed photograph on my appraisal table now, one I didn't have before any of this happened. Walter at his father's workbench, maybe 9 years old, a loop far too big for his face, concentrating on some small mechanism with the particular seriousness only children and watchmakers seem to manage. I look at it before every difficult appraisal, and I looked at it again the morning after that Sunday dinner, before I called Harold to confirm the notice, before any of the repayment schedule or the codicil or the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust with my own son had properly begun. It reminds me that Walter spent his whole life building things meant to outlast him, and that the only way to honor that kind of patience is with an equal amount of my own. I spent 35 years telling other people what their possessions were actually worth. I am only now, at 69, learning to say out loud what the same skill is worth when you finally turn it on your own family. The IRS has a term for looking the other way when you already suspect the truth. My profession doesn't have an official term for it, but I've started using one anyway. I call it an unverified appraisal, and I don't hand those out anymore, not to strangers, and never again to my own family. Physical manila folder that now held 11 months of documentation, and I began preparing not for a family conversation, but for a hearing, and for the family conversation I intended to have first, on my terms, before that hearing ever needed to happen. If you've ever built something with your own hands, a family, a fortune, a life, and had someone close to you quietly plan to take it before you were even finished living in it, stay with me. This is where it turns. I called Diane in Denver that same evening and told her everything, including the petition. She was on a flight 2 days later, taking emergency leave from the hospital, because Diane, whatever else has shifted in this family, has never once hesitated when I actually needed her. I asked Harold whether we should simply fight the petition in court, quietly, attorney to attorney, without ever confronting Preston and Vanessa directly. Harold left the decision to me, but he was candid about the tactical advantage either path offered. A courtroom win embarrasses them in front of a judge. A family confrontation, done right, with the same evidence, embarrasses them in front of people whose opinion they'll have to live with for the rest of their lives, and it lets you control exactly how much mercy gets extended afterward. Courts don't do mercy, Nora. Families can. I chose the family. Not because I wanted to spare Preston. Because I wanted him, and Vanessa, and Tabitha Reyes, to understand exactly what they had built, in a room where I could look each of them in the eye and decide, in real time, how much of their future I was willing to let this destroy. I invited them to dinner. Preston, Vanessa, and, at my specific insistence, Tabitha Reyes, whom I described in the invitation only as someone I understand has been advising the family, and I'd like her included in this conversation. I invited Diane, who flew in and sat quietly beside me. I invited June, who came not as a friend that night but, at my request, in the capacity closest to her old professional life, to observe and, if it ever became necessary, to testify to exactly what she witnessed. And I invited Harold Voss, who arrived in a gray suit with a legal pad and sat at the end of my table the way he once sat at the end of conference tables defeating exactly this kind of petition for other families. I set my table the way I used to lay out client files at Lowcountry Trust before a difficult meeting, everything in its place, everything with purpose. Walter's good plates, the ones from our 30th anniversary. A pot roast, because some conversations deserve to happen over a meal that took real time to prepare, so no one can later say the whole evening was cold. And beside my own plate, the manila folder, now grown to 96 pages, tabbed, numbered, a table of contents on the first page the way I organized every trust file I ever presented in a dispute. Preston arrived first, kissed my cheek, told me the pot roast smelled wonderful, and had no idea what was coming. Vanessa arrived polished, warm, calling me Nora in the bright voice she uses when she wants a room to feel comfortable. Tabitha arrived last, a little confused about why she'd been invited to a family dinner at all, which told me she did not yet understand how much I already knew about her role in this. We ate first. I insisted on it, the same way I once insisted every difficult client meeting begin with basic civility, because you do not deliver hard truths to a person who hasn't been given the chance to sit down and settle first. We talked about Mason's baseball season and Lily's tap recital. Vanessa complimented the pot roast. Preston refilled everyone's water glasses, the good host, the good son, performing a version of himself I once believed in completely. When the plates were cleared, I asked Preston to walk Mason and Lily, whom Diane had brought over separately for the evening, into the den to watch a movie, because what came next was not for them. He did, and when he returned and sat back down, I placed my hand flat on the folder and I began. "I'd like to talk about a phone call," I said, "that I overheard in your sunroom 11 months ago." Preston's face changed instantly. "You told Tabitha, quote, once she's gone, we split the 4.2. 50-50, that's what you agreed." The table went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when the thing everyone has been avoiding finally has a name. Vanessa's hand moved to her water glass and did not pick it up. "Mom, that's not, I don't even remember saying that exactly." "I do," I said. "I have spent 35 years being precise about exactly what I hear in a room. It is the one professional habit I never learned to turn off." I opened the folder to the first tab. "I'd like to walk through what's happened since that phone call, in order, with dates. All of you are welcome to correct anything I get wrong, provided you can show me documentation that contradicts it." Tab 1. I laid the clinic record on the table, the confirmation letter from the office manager stating plainly that no examination of me had ever taken place before Preston called and described symptoms to an intake nurse. 6 weeks before I overheard that phone call, "Preston, you called a clinic I have never visited and described a fall in my driveway that never happened, and a level of confusion I have never experienced." That call created a medical record, without an examination, that could later be used to support a competency finding. I let that sit. Preston's face had gone the particular gray of a man watching a wall he built come down from the inside. Vanessa's mouth opened. "Preston, you told me the doctor called us, you said." "Vanessa, I'll get to your part," I said, gently, but without stopping. Tab 2. I placed Rose's handwritten, signed statement on the table. 4 months ago, Tabitha, you asked my housekeeper, unprompted, whether I seemed forgetful, whether I left the stove on, whether I seemed confused in her presence. She told you no. She told you I was sharper than her own mother. You wrote something down anyway." Tabitha's face had gone very still, the stillness of a professional realizing her name has entered a file she did not expect to be in. "I don't recall the specifics of that conversation," Tabitha said carefully. "I have Rose's statement, dated and signed, describing it in her own words. I'd rather you review it than dispute my memory of it." I placed it directly in front of her. She read it. She said nothing further. Tab 3. I placed Dr. Patel's 11-page evaluation on the table. 4.5 months ago, I underwent a full independent psychiatric and cognitive evaluation, on my own initiative, funded by my own money, conducted by a specialist with no relationship to this family. Her conclusion, in her own words, is that my cognitive function is significantly above age-adjusted norms, with no clinical indication of impairment in any domain assessed. I turned the report so Preston could read the highlighted conclusion himself. This was completed before you filed anything, Preston. Which means whatever petition you filed afterward was filed with an independent, current, contradicting evaluation already sitting in existence, whether you knew it or not. Preston's hands had gone flat on the table, the exact posture of a man realizing the ground had already shifted before he ever took his first step onto it. Tab 4. I placed the second plate of record, the one from the appointment Preston himself had arranged after I deliberately told him I'd been forgetful, on top of the file. 2 weeks after our phone call, you scheduled an appointment for me at the same clinic. I attended it. I passed every screening measure cleanly, on an actual record, with an actual examination behind it this time. You arranged the very appointment that created the strongest evidence against your own petition. Mom, I don't understand, you said you were having trouble. I know what I said, Preston. I said it on purpose, because I needed to understand exactly how far this had already gone before I intervened. At the bank, we called that letting a subject demonstrate the full scope of their intent before you close the file. I'm sorry it required deceiving you, briefly. I am not sorry about what it revealed. I turned to the final section. Tab 5. I placed the court filing index printout on the table, the petition for emergency temporary guardianship filed 11 days ago, Preston's name listed as proposed guardian of both my person and my estate. The room went colder than the pot roast on the table. Vanessa's eyes moved to Preston, then to the folder, then to Harold, sitting quietly at the end of the table with his own legal pad, and I watched her do the math a real estate agent does instinctively, the math of a woman who has spent her career reading exactly how much trouble a piece of paper can represent. Harold Voss has reviewed this petition in full, I said. He is prepared to appear at the hearing in 6 days with Dr. Patel's evaluation, the clinic's written confirmation that the original chart note was fabricated without examination, and a sworn statement from a longtime employee describing an unsolicited attempt to manufacture evidence of decline. I am prepared, Harold tells me, to have this petition dismissed with prejudice, and depending on how today goes, potentially referred for review regarding the fabricated medical record. Vanessa spoke first, her voice climbing in the particular register of someone reaching for the version of the story where she is the wronged party. Nora, we were scared. Preston's income has been unstable for 4 years. We have 2 kids, tuition. We watched you get older after Walter died and we panicked about what would happen to that money if something happened to you before. Before what, Vanessa? I asked, and I kept my voice as gentle as I have ever kept it, which I have learned, over 35 years, unsettles people far more than anger does. Before I actually died? Because that's the plan the trust already accounts for. 60% to my children, 40% to my grandchildren, staged over their lifetimes, exactly as Walter and I structured it decades ago. You did not need a guardianship petition to receive what was always going to be yours eventually. You needed one to receive it now, while I was still alive to disagree with how you spent it. Preston's voice came out smaller than I had heard it since he was a boy. It wasn't about the money being available now, Mom. It was, Tabitha said if we waited for you to actually pass, we might be looking at years, decades even, and the restaurant loan, the second mortgage, we're barely. I know exactly what state your finances are in, Preston, because I co-signed a $310,000 loan for a restaurant that failed, and I have watched you struggle under the weight of that decision for 4 years with genuine sympathy. But sympathy for your fear does not excuse manufacturing a false medical record to take control of my life before I've finished living it. I turned, finally, to Tabitha. You told my daughter-in-law, in my own backyard, 14 months ago, that a competency evaluation moves fast with 2 documented data points. You told my housekeeper, unprompted, to watch for symptoms I don't have. You have a placement fee waiting for you at Camellia Manor if I end up there. I've spent 35 years reading exactly this kind of financial incentive into exactly this kind of professional advice. I don't believe you're malicious, Tabitha. I believe you've done this enough times that it stopped feeling like harm to you a long time ago. But it is harm, and Harold has already begun drafting a complaint to your licensing board. Tabitha said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't have made it worse. Diane spoke for the first time that evening, quietly, to her brother. Preston, she asked me last month if I thought Mom was still sharp. I didn't think anything of it. I keep thinking about how many small strange things I didn't think anything of. The dining room held the particular silence that follows a long-avoided truth finally being spoken aloud and full. Vanessa was crying, not performing tears exactly, but not entirely without an eye on how the room was receiving them either. Preston sat with his head in his hands. Tabitha stared at the tablecloth. I closed the folder. Here's what happens now, I said, in the same measured voice I once used to explain a distribution schedule to a grieving widow. Harold will appear at the hearing in 6 days. The petition will be withdrawn, or it will be dismissed on the record, along with everything that comes with a dismissal on this evidence. That part is not negotiable, and it does not depend on anything said at this table tonight. I let that settle. What is negotiable is what happens to this family afterward, and that depends entirely on what I hear in the next few minutes. Preston lifted his head. Mom, I am so sorry. I don't have a version of this where I don't look like exactly what I am, which is a man who let his own fear turn into something unforgivable. I don't know how to undo it. You don't undo 11 months of this in one dinner, Preston. But I will tell you what I told 100 families over 35 years who came to me after a fracture like this one. Money you take before it's rightfully yours is never actually money. It's a debt you owe the person you took it from, whether a court ever calls it that or not. You owe me 11 months of decisions I now have to live with knowing you made. That debt doesn't clear because you're sorry tonight. It clears slowly, the way trust always rebuilds, which is to say, one honest year at a time. I looked at Vanessa. You are Mason and Lily's mother, and I love those children without condition, and nothing that happened this year changes that. But I want you to understand something clearly. I am not confused. I am not declining. I built the very trust you were trying to access early, and I built it, deliberately, so that no single person in this family could ever move that money faster than time and good judgment allow. That includes me. It includes Preston. It always included whoever eventually tried exactly what you tried. I turned to the folder one last time. The trust itself does not change tonight. 60% to my children, 40% staged to my grandchildren, exactly as Walter and I always intended. I am not disinheriting anyone in anger, because Walter didn't build that structure so I could weaponize it in a moment of hurt. But I am, as of Monday morning, moving the successor trustee designation from an unnamed corporate trustee to Diane, effective immediately upon any future incapacity of my own, removing any ambiguity that could ever again be exploited. Preston nodded slowly, understanding exactly what that meant, and did not argue with it, which told me something honest was finally happening in him. And Tabitha, I said, you will not set foot in my home again, and I would ask that you not offer Preston or Vanessa any further guidance regarding my care, ever. Before she gathered her purse to go, Tabitha said one more thing, quietly, not quite an apology and not quite an excuse. The way people speak when they're trying to explain themselves to their own conscience more than to the room. I've done this for 11 years. I've placed 40, 50 families into care, and most of the time I'm the person who makes an impossible decision easier for everyone. I stopped asking myself, a long time ago, whether the parent actually needed it, or just whether the family wanted it fast. She looked at me, and for the first time all evening, something in her face looked genuinely uncertain. I don't think I've thought about that difference in years, until tonight. I didn't offer her comfort. I didn't offer her forgiveness either. I only said, that difference is the entire job, Tabitha. I hope you find your way back to asking it. She left within minutes after that, quietly, without further argument, because there was nothing left in that room that belonged to her. The hearing, 6 days later, lasted less than 40 minutes. Harold presented Dr. Patel's evaluation, the clinic's written confirmation regarding the fabricated first record, and Rosa's signed statement. The judge, a woman named Constance Ebride who Harold had appeared before a dozen times over the years, read through the file with the particular quiet of someone who has seen this exact pattern before and does not enjoy seeing it again. She dismissed the petition with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled on the same grounds, and noted for the record her concern regarding the origin of the initial clinic note, referring that specific matter to the State Medical Board for review of the clinic's documentation practices. Preston did not contest the dismissal. He sat in the back row of the courtroom, in a gray suit, and did not say a word the entire hearing, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him was relieved the fight was over even though he had started it. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I've been a certified appraiser for 35 years, and in 35 years, I have never once misjudged what a thing was truly worth. My daughter-in-law thought a grieving widow with 11 watches in a safe wouldn't notice 2 or 3 going missing. She was wrong. I notice everything. That isn't a gift. It's 35 years of training, applied, finally, to the one collection I never thought I'd need to protect from the inside. If you've ever built something careful, something precise, and had someone in your own family decide it was simply theirs for the taking, I hope this reminded you to look a little closer at the things you love, and at the people standing closest to them. Catalog what matters. Write down the numbers. And if something ever goes missing, don't accuse first. Verify. The truth holds up far better than anger does, and it lasts a great deal longer, too. That's my story. One empty velvet case, one hidden ledger, one late husband's private notebook hidden inside a hidden compartment, and a family that is still, slowly, one small payment at a time, learning the actual, hard-won difference between what something costs and what it's genuinely worth. If this reminded you to check your own safe, or to finally have the conversation you've been avoiding, drop a comment below. Subscribe to GM Mom Stories for more, and remember, the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be documented.